The United States national debt just crossed $39 trillion. Right now, the United States pays approximately $1.2 trillion per year just in interest on that debt, not paying down the principal, not reducing what we owe, just interest. Cool, $1.2 trillion. That's more than the entire defense budget, more than we spend on Medicare, more than all discretionary spending combined. And that number is about to explode because over the next 3 years, $9 trillion in existing US debt matures and needs to be refinanced. That debt was originally issued when interest rates were 0% to 2%. It's now being refinanced at 4% to 5%. When that refinancing is complete, annual interest payments will rise from $1.2 trillion to over $2 trillion, $2 trillion per year just to service debt. That's 35% of all federal tax revenue going purely to interest payments. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how America accumulated $39 trillion in debt. Why? It's mathematically impossible to repay. The sea was calm that morning when the first cracks appeared, so subtle that most seafarers didn't notice. Ships simply listed a degree more than usual, ropes creaked a fraction louder, and by the time the hulls began to splinter, it was already too late. What began as whispering pressures beneath the surface became an irresistible force that no captain could steer away from. This pattern, older than any modern nation, unfolded again and again throughout history, an empire strong beyond imagination, confident in its dominion, eventually undone by the slow build of its own unseen weight. Long before the sun rose on modern skylines, the cycles were already written in the dust of ancient capitals and in the ledgers of long-dead treasurers. Empires that stretched across continents saw debt accumulate like hidden storms on the horizon. What once was manageable became burdensome. What was burdensome became unserviceable. At first, the people in power scarcely felt the strain. Wealth continued to flow. Parades marched. Markets hummed. But beneath the surface, structural tensions grew. Promises made yesterday required resources today that the system could no longer muster. The obligations multiplied. The capacity to pay diminished. And yet no one sounded the alarm, for to do so would be to admit vulnerability. Anathema to leaders whose power was tied to the projection of confidence. History is filled with this slow-motion collapse, unremarkable in the moment, unrecognized until the end, and always following a pattern that, in retrospect, seems unavoidable. An economic system begins to overextend, taking on commitments without the productive base to support them. New layers of borrowing hide earlier weaknesses. Confidence, once abundant, is quietly leased for future promises. And then, just as resources can no longer match obligations, the tipping point arrives, not with thunderous rupture, but with the softest of final breaths. What makes these collapses so powerful is their subtlety. They start in the markets and in the minds of lenders and spenders before the rest of society notices anything amiss. The first signs are statistical: debt-to-output ratios rising, returns on investment falling, growth slowing imperceptibly. Only later, when wages stagnate and social discontent increases, do the more visible consequences emerge. By then, the underlying economic mechanisms have already shifted. The system may still look strong on the surface, but beneath it, the foundations have shifted. This is the pattern of collapse, and it has played out across civilizations. From the great dynasties of antiquity to the mercantile powers of early modern Europe. Each assumed its dominance was eternal, its prosperity secured, its debts manageable. Each was ultimately undone not by sudden catastrophe, but by the gradual accumulation of obligations that outpaced their capacity to fulfill them. Today, that same quiet force is at work again, this time measured not in Bronze Age talents or medieval florins, but in trillions of dollars. The numbers are vast, the institutions familiar, the confidence immense. Yet the underlying dynamic is the same: commitments growing faster than the ability to pay, promises made year after year without pause for the mounting burden they create. The sea is still calm, the horizon still bright, but beneath, the pressure continues to build, and the inevitable pattern unfolds with an indifference to reassurance. When it finally breaks, it will not be with a shout, but with the quiet realization that the weight no longer can be held. And in that moment, the illusions of permanence will fall away, leaving only the stark reality of history's unyielding cycles, cycles in which no power is exempt and no debt is ever truly forgotten. What systemic collapse looks like in reality rarely resembles the cinematic imagery of revolutions or invading armies. It begins in spreadsheets. It begins in bond markets. It begins in the slow divergence between what a nation produces and what it promises. Every large-scale collapse follows a structure so consistent it can be mapped long before the final stage arrives. First comes expansion. Growth is real, productivity rises, innovation accelerates, and borrowing is used to amplify opportunity. Debt, in this phase, is a tool. It finances infrastructure, industry, and influence. The system earns more than it owes. Second comes normalization. Borrowing becomes routine. Because growth has been strong, credit is abundant and cheap. The memory of constraint fades, debt ratios inch upward, but confidence remains intact. Political incentives shift towards short-term stability rather than long-term balance. Third comes distortion. Consumption begins to outpace production. Structural deficits form, not because of crisis, but because of habit. Borrowing fills the gap between what the economy generates and what society expects. Monetary authorities smooth volatility, suppress interest costs, and ensure markets remain calm. The illusion of stability deepens precisely as fragility increases. Fourth comes dependency. Entire sectors of the economy become reliant on perpetual borrowing. Asset prices reflect not underlying productivity, but the expectation of continued liquidity. Government spending supports demand that private productivity can no longer sustain. Growth slows, but expenditures do not. Debt compounds faster than output. Fifth comes constraint. Servicing the debt consumes a growing share of national resources. Interest payments crowd out investment. Policy flexibility narrows. Every shock, whether financial, geopolitical, or demographic, requires more borrowing to offset. The system can still function, but only with increasing intervention. Sixth comes credibility strain. Lenders begin to reassess risk, not abruptly, not dramatically, but gradually. Confidence erodes at the margins. Borrowing costs rise, even slightly, and because the debt is so large, even small changes produce disproportionate effects. Fiscal space disappears. And finally, the irreversible phase arrives. This does not necessarily mean default. It may mean currency debasement. It may mean restructuring. It may mean prolonged stagnation. But the defining feature is this: the system can no longer grow its way out. The promises exceed the productive base permanently. Collapse, then, is not a single event. It is the culmination of incentives that reward postponement over correction. It is slow until it is not. For years, even decades, the stages overlap. The system feels stable, institutions appear solid, markets continue to function. And yet beneath the surface, the imbalance widens. Crucially, collapse begins economically because economics governs capacity. Political structures can endure only so long as resources allow them to. Military strength is funded by surplus. Social cohesion depends on prosperity. When the economic engine weakens, everything else follows in sequence. The most dangerous moment in this cycle is the period just before irreversibility, when the numbers are visible, the strain measurable, but the belief persists that time remains. It is during this phase that systems convince themselves that scale alone guarantees safety, that because collapse has not happened yet, it will not happen at all. But scale does not prevent gravity. It only determines how long the fall takes. And history shows that when obligations compound faster than productive capacity, even the largest systems eventually confront the same reality. Promises must be reconciled with the resources. The framework is clear. The stages are consistent. The progression is patient. And once a system enters the later phases, history suggests there is only one question left. Not whether adjustment will occur, but how. At its height, the Empire of Rome commanded territory stretching from Britain to the edges of Mesopotamia. Its roads stitched continents together. Its legions secured trade routes. Its currency, the denarius, circulated across 3 continents as a symbol of reliability and power. For centuries, Rome's dominance rested on a simple formula: disciplined expansion, productive agriculture, efficient taxation, and the steady inflow of tribute from conquered lands. In its early rise, Rome's debt was not its defining feature. Wealth flowed inward from newly acquired provinces. Grain from Egypt fed its population. Precious metals from Iberia backed its currency. Military victories financed future campaigns. Productivity and expansion reinforced one another. Rome did not merely spend, it produced, extracted, and accumulated. But expansion carries a hidden cost. As borders extended, so did obligations. The empire required more legions to secure longer frontiers. Infrastructure demanded maintenance. Urban populations in Rome itself grew dependent on subsidized grain and public entertainment. The state began promising stability and abundance not only to its elites, but to its masses. Consumption expanded faster than conquest. When territorial expansion slowed in the 2nd century, the inflow of new wealth declined, yet expenditures did not contract. Instead, they grew. Military payrolls increased. Patently, political leaders competed to secure loyalty through spending. The empire began to fund its obligations not through productivity, but through monetary manipulation. The silver content of the denarius was gradually reduced. Under emperors like Nero and later Caracalla, debasement accelerated. What had once been a reliable coin became diluted. In the short term, this allowed Rome to meet payrolls and sustain appearances. In the long term, it eroded confidence. Prices rose, trade distorted, trust frayed. As productivity stagnated, taxation intensified. Farmers abandoned land under mounting burdens. Local economies contracted. The empire, once fueled by surplus, increasingly relied on coercion to extract resources. Wealth still moved through Rome. Vast sums were spent on armies, palaces, and spectacles, but it no longer remained within a productive cycle. It flowed outward into maintenance of a system too large for its base. By the 3rd century, Rome entered a cycle of instability. Emperors rose and fell rapidly. Currency debasement became severe. Soldiers were paid in increasingly worthless coin. Economic fragmentation followed. Regions turned inward, prioritizing survival over integration. The empire did not collapse in a single moment. It decayed structurally. By the time the Western Empire formally fell in 476, much of its economic vitality had already eroded. Rome's fate was not sealed by invasion alone. The invasions came after the economic foundation had weakened. The decisive shift occurred when obligations exceeded productive capacity, when maintaining dominance required more resources than the economy could sustainably provide. Rome believed its scale ensured permanence. Its roads, legions, and bureaucracy appeared invincible. But the system's internal incentives rewarded short-term stability over long-term balance. Debasement masked strain. Borrowing from the future disguised present weakness. And while wealth continued to circulate, it ceased to compound. The pattern is unmistakable: rising commitments, monetary distortion, declining productivity, and eventual structural fracture. Rome did not run out of ambition, it ran out of capacity. The lesson is not that all empires fall suddenly. It is that when debt replaces discipline and currency replaces production as the engine of growth, decline becomes a process that cannot easily be reversed. And Rome, convinced of its exceptionalism, discovered that scale could delay gravity, but never eliminate it. Centuries later, in a different hemisphere, and under entirely different institutions, another system would repeat the same logic, convinced that modern sophistication made it immune to ancient outcomes. In the early 20th century, the British Empire stood at the center of global finance. The pound sterling functioned as the world's reserve currency. Capital flowed through London's markets with extraordinary efficiency. Insurance, shipping, commodities, and banking were anchored in institutions that had matured over centuries. The empire spanned continents, and its financial system appeared unassailable. At the heart of this system stood the Bank of England, guardian of sterling's credibility and steward of a vast global payments network. For decades, Britain's dominance rested not only on military reach, but on trust. Sterling-denominated debt was considered safe. British government bonds were widely held. The empire's trade surplus and industrial output reinforced that confidence. Then came the 20th century's rupture. World War I forced Britain to borrow on a scale previously unimaginable. Gold reserves dwindled, debt surged. To finance the war effort, the government issued massive quantities of bonds, relying heavily on loans from the United States. When the war ended, Britain faced a dilemma: restore the pound to its pre-war gold parity or accept devaluation and diminished prestige. In 1925, under Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill, Britain returned to the gold standard at the old exchange rate. The decision was framed as a restoration of stability. In reality, it imposed a severe constraint on an economy weakened by debt and declining industrial competitiveness. The pound was overvalued, exports suffered, unemployment rose. The financial system strained under the weight of preserving credibility. The belief persisted that Britain's financial sophistication made it different from past empires. London remained a global hub. Capital markets were deep, institutions were mature. Yet beneath the surface, the same structural imbalance had formed. Obligations outpaced productive renewal. When the Great Depression spread across global markets, confidence faltered. Gold reserves drained rapidly as investors converted sterling. By 1931, Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard. The pound depreciated sharply. The empire did not collapse overnight, but its monetary dominance never fully recovered. Over the following decades, leadership shifted decisively to the United States. What is striking is not the crisis itself, but the period preceding it. Britain's leaders believed institutional prestige would compensate for economic weakness. They believed history granted permanence. They believed that because the system had endured for centuries, it would continue to endure. But the stages had already unfolded: expansion, normalization of borrowing, distortion to maintain prestige, dependency on capital inflows, and finally constraint when markets questioned credibility. The collapse was not chaotic, it was structural. Sterling remained a currency, Britain remained a nation. But the era of unquestioned financial supremacy ended. "This time is different" is a phrase that appears in every late-stage system. It rests on the assumption that modern tools, better central banks, more advanced markets, global integration, alter the fundamental arithmetic of debt and productivity. Yet the British experience showed that institutional maturity does not repeal economic gravity. It merely changes the form in which adjustment arrives. The pattern held, the scale differed, the outcome followed the same logic. And now, in the modern era, the numbers are no longer measured in millions or billions, but in trillions, on a scale that dwarfs anything those earlier systems could have imagined. Today, the United States carries a national debt that has crossed $39 trillion. The figure is so large it has lost intuitive meaning. It is discussed in headlines, debated in legislative chambers, and tracked in real time on public dashboards. Yet its scale alone does not define the risk. What matters is the structure beneath it, the incentives, the productivity base, and the cost of sustaining it. At the center of the modern system stands the US Department of the Treasury, issuing debt instruments that remain among the most widely held assets in global finance. The US dollar, supported by deep capital markets and the institutional authority of the Federal Reserve, functions as the primary reserve currency of the world. This arrangement grants the United States extraordinary flexibility. It can borrow in its own currency. It can refinance obligations at scale. It can influence global liquidity conditions. For decades, this structure reinforced itself. Persistent deficits were absorbed by global demand for safe assets. Foreign central banks accumulated treasuries as reserves. Domestic investors relied on them as collateral. Low interest rates reduced the apparent burden of rising debt. Growth, while uneven, remained sufficient to preserve confidence. But structural forces have shifted. Mandatory spending obligations tied to demographics, healthcare, pensions, entitlements grow automatically. Political incentives reward current expenditure over deferred adjustment. Productivity growth has slowed relative to earlier eras. Meanwhile, total federal debt has expanded faster than economic output. Servicing costs now consume an increasing share of federal revenue. As interest rates normalize from historic lows, even modest increases compound across trillions of dollars in obligations. What once felt manageable under near-zero rates becomes more restrictive when borrowing costs rise. The constraint phase emerges not as panic, but as arithmetic. Importantly, this is not a story of mismanagement alone. It is a story of incentives. Voters prefer stability. Politicians respond to immediate pressures. Financial markets price near-term risk more heavily than distant liabilities. The system, as designed, postpones correction, because postponement carries fewer short-term consequences than austerity. Confidence remains strong. The dollar continues to dominate global trade and finance. US Treasury markets remain deep and liquid, yet history suggests that systems do not fracture because of their strengths. They fracture when strengths mask underlying strain. If debt grows persistently faster than productive capacity, adjustment eventually becomes unavoidable. That adjustment may take the form of inflation eroding real value. It may take the form of financial repression, keeping interest rates below inflation to gradually reduce the burden. It may take the form of prolonged stagnation, where growth slows under the weight of servicing obligations. What it cannot do indefinitely is expand without consequence. The critical point is this: systems fail when incentives break, not when intentions fail. The United States possesses vast resources, innovative capacity, and institutional depth. But if structural deficits remain embedded and debt continues compounding faster than output, even the most resilient framework faces narrowing options. The sea remains calm, markets function, bonds are issued and purchased daily. Yet beneath that routine, the arithmetic advances with quiet precision, indifferent to political debate or public fatigue. And as the numbers climb, the margin for flexibility contracts, gradually, almost invisibly. Late-stage systems rarely appear unstable, they appear normal. And it is precisely in that normality that acceleration begins. Late-stage systems often feel most stable just before acceleration. Institutions grow more confident in their tools. Policymakers refine language to reassure markets. Risk models rely on recent history, which, during extended periods of calm, appears benign. Volatility declines. Asset prices rise. The very absence of crisis becomes evidence that crisis is unlikely. In this phase, normalization of risk becomes cultural. Elevated debt levels are described as sustainable because they have been sustained so far. Rising servicing costs are framed as temporary fluctuations. Structural deficits are justified by comparison to past emergencies. Each incremental increase appears manageable in isolation. The compounding effect remains abstract. Institutional denial does not require deception. It emerges naturally from incentives. Elected officials operate within short-time horizons. Central banks focus on financial stability. Investors chase yield within prevailing policy frameworks. Media narratives emphasize resilience. No single actor intends instability. Yet collectively, the system drifts deeper into dependency on continued borrowing and controlled liquidity. As debt grows, so does sensitivity. A small rise in interest rates now carries outsized fiscal consequences. A mild recession requires disproportionately large stimulus to offset. Credit markets become more interconnected, liquidity becomes more essential, the margin for error shrinks. Paradoxically, the more tools institutions deploy to maintain stability, the more markets assume those tools will always be available. This expectation embeds moral hazard into the system. Risk-taking increases under the belief that severe downside will be cushioned. Asset valuations stretch. Capital allocation becomes less disciplined. Productivity growth suffers quietly beneath financial expansion. Warnings during this stage are often dismissed not because they lack logic, but because they lack urgency. The crisis has not yet arrived. Bond auctions continue to clear. Currency markets remain orderly. Consumers still spend. Employment data still fluctuates within normal ranges. The surface appears intact, but acceleration does not announce itself in advance. It emerges when compounding pressures converge, when rising servicing costs meet slowing growth, when fiscal space narrows alongside external shocks, when confidence shifts just enough to alter borrowing conditions. Because the system is so large, change appears gradual, yet because obligations are so vast, even gradual change can become decisive. By the time policy responses intensify, options are fewer. Choices narrow to trade-offs between inflation and austerity, between currency stability and growth support. None of these paths are catastrophic in isolation. But each reflects constraint rather than freedom. Late-stage systems rarely collapse in spectacle. They recalibrate under pressure. Living standards adjust. Wealth distribution shifts. Influence migrates slowly to new centers of productivity. And for those within the system, the transition feels less like an explosion and more like a subtle, irreversible drift. History does not repeat because people are reckless or malicious. It repeats because incentives persist. Every generation inherits institutions built in a different era, under different constraints, and then adapts them to new pressures. Over time, those adaptations accumulate. Promises expand, expectations solidify. Debt becomes not an emergency tool, but a structural feature. The arithmetic, however, never changes. Resources are finite. Productivity determines capacity. Borrowing shifts consumption forward, but it does not eliminate the obligation. When commitments compound faster than output, adjustment eventually arrives, not as punishment, but as reconciliation. The United States remains innovative, resource-rich, and institutionally complex. It commands deep capital markets, technological leadership, and global influence. None of these strengths disappear overnight. Rome did not cease to be Rome in a single day. Britain did not vanish when sterling weakened. Great powers rarely implode. They evolve under constraint. The question is not whether America can pay back $39 trillion in the literal sense. Large sovereign debts are rarely extinguished outright. They are managed, rolled over, diluted, or restructured over time. The more fundamental issue is whether the economy can grow faster than the obligations attached to it, whether productivity can outpace promises, whether incentives can shift before constraint becomes dominant. If growth persistently trails debt accumulation, the adjustment will take a form that redistributes burden through inflation, slower real growth, financial repression, or shifts in global monetary influence. None of these outcomes require dramatic headlines. They unfold gradually, altering purchasing power, investment patterns, and geopolitical leverage over years rather than weeks. Systems fail when incentives encourage postponement beyond feasibility. They endure when discipline aligns with capacity. The tension between those forces defines every economic cycle in history. There is a quiet humility in recognizing this pattern. No empire believed its dominance was temporary. No financial system imagined its architecture would be surpassed. Yet each operated within the same constraints of production and debt, confidence and credibility. The present moment is not unprecedented. It is part of a continuum. The scale is larger. The tools are more sophisticated. The numbers are measured in trillions instead of talents or pounds sterling. But the underlying structure remains constant. When obligations outgrow output, time becomes the most valuable and most limited asset. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.